The Federal Reserve System virtually controls the nation's monetary system.